the sermon time because there's just so much material, and honestly it's quite a bit to cover. I'm not sure if it's worked well or not, because what I've tried to do is cover all of Judges chapter 17 all the way through Ruth chapter 4. Those 9 chapters are in a row on purpose in the Bible. They come from the same time period during a time of severe famine, and they all center around Bethlehem. So there's so much material. We haven't really had, jokes or a lot of illustrations like I normally would have, because there's just, I wanted to make sure to cover all the stuff. We'll have a little bit of that today in this series that's called Judging Ruth. And when I say Judging Ruth, it means I'm mixing the 2 Bible books. I'm meshing Judges with Ruth. The last 5 chapters of Judges with the 4 chapters of Ruth, Judging Ruth. Today's message is the 3rd in the series, and it's titled Rules of Engagement. Rules of Engagement because this is learned about in the story where Boaz pledges his loyal love to Ruth, and they are engaged. And they do get married, and God blesses them tremendously. Let's read from Ruth chapter 3, beginning at verse number 1. And if you want to follow along, if you have a smartphone or a device, you can go to the YouVersion Bible app. Just search for live events. All of the notes of the sermon are on there, and it will even let you keep track of notes. You could email it to yourself if you want to. So if you have trouble finding it, if you're able to, you can go to the church website, for instance, and you can find it there as well. Ruth chapter 3. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for." Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, and don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had told her to do. Now, I want to break this down for you in really bite-sized pieces. Notice the first verse. It says that it tells us that Naomi, she really feels a sense of obligation. She feels obligated to provide for her daughter-in-law. The word used to describe her here is not just mother-in-law, but it's actually the feminine form of what would normally be father-in-law. It's a stronger way of getting the point across. In Arabic culture, it literally means to protect, to defend. The root of the word means to be protection or shelter or refuge. And this is a role that Naomi takes very seriously. She's the provider. She's the protector. Now, this was a huge step for Ruth, to go down to the threshing floor. We may not be able to visualize what that really means, but the threshing floor was a very public place. It's like the town center. It's the gathering place. It's the town square. And what makes this interesting is that when the book of Ruth was translated from Hebrew into the Syrian language, follow me for just a moment, it's a little technical, but originally it was written in Hebrew, and it was translated into the Syrian language, and the Syriac Bible chose to use a different word in chapter 3, verse 2, than it had used in the previous chapter, chapter 2, verse 1. In other words, in the Syriac translation, it used the word kinsman in chapter 2. But when they came to chapter 3, they used another word for kinsman, and the root of that word is to know, and particularly to know in a sexual way. Now, I'm going somewhere with this, and stay with me. Hebrew was the original language it's written in, not Syrian, but at least that lets you know that way back there, at the beginning, in the earliest times, there was this way of thinking that this implied intimacy. And then when you read verse number 3, you see the words, "Don't let him know you," are there. The words know, yada, the famous Hebrew word that carries connotations of intimacy. Adam knew Eve, and she conceived a child. It's that same idea. Now, don't let that throw you. Don't be upset by it. Nowhere in the Bible is it more subtle than right here in the book of Ruth. It is so holy and respectful and pure. Naomi is actually cautioning her daughter-in-law, don't let him know you too quickly. In fact, Michael Moore grades this whole text on a scale, and he says this is the highest point of morality. This is the highest point. It's stark contrast to one of the stories we read the last time we were together, Judges 19:22. Remember story number 2? They were a bunch of thugs. They surrounded a house and beat on the door. He says that was the lowest point. A gang of violent men taunt and terrorize a frightened old Gibeonite, and they demand that he bring his guest out of the house, out into the public square, so that they can know him. Same exact words. So they were destructive and violent, but Ruth is a picture of patience and gentleness. I think that says huge volumes to us. Listen to me, every person in the room, not just young people. Guard the most precious, intimate moments of your life powerfully and prayerfully. Don't be too fast to race into territory that's holy and set apart for God. And then I want you to notice verses 5 and 6. It says, I will do whatever you say. This is a powerful picture of obedience. Obedience, so important. By the way, notice that Ruth doesn't say that she will do whatever Boaz says. It's interesting. Even though Naomi just said to her, he will tell you what to do. But she says to her mother-in-law, I will do whatever you tell me to do. And in fact, the truth is, Ruth ends up telling Boaz what she wants him to do for her. Now, this is way different from earlier in the story. Remember Ruth chapter 1? Naomi, the mother-in-law, commands Ruth to go back to her mother's home. Go back to her gods. Just go back to your original town. Just try to start again. And Ruth, she's polite about it, but she disregards her mother-in-law. She's very respectful. She doesn't snub her in any way, but she just rejects that strategy totally. And she says, here, though, I will do whatever you say. And just what was it that Naomi wanted her to do? Well, in the book of Ruth, there's this series of commands that happen over and over. In fact, in this short little book, there's 3 different places where you have 3 different people giving these commands to do something. They're referred to as the command sequences. So in chapter 1, Ruth has some words for her mother-in-law. Don't urge me to leave. Don't urge me to turn back from you. It really should be, stop urging me. Stop it. Apparently, the daughter and the mother-in-law have a real good relationship. And then in chapter 2, Boaz has a few commands. The very first time he encounters Ruth, he says, don't go away from me. Don't go. Come over here. Have some bread. Dip it in the vinegar. So he's giving out commands. You've had Ruth giving commands, and now Boaz giving commands. And now, here in chapter 3, we find out that Mama Naomi has a few commands of her own up her sleeve. And here's what she says in chapter 3. Wash, anoint, put on, go down, do not make known, know, go, uncover, lie down, wait. It's the command sequences. And Naomi is giving commands to her daughter-in-law. And Naomi's daughter-in-law, Ruth, says, I will do exactly what you say to do. It's a beautiful picture of obedience. So now, with a message like this, you have a lot of reading to do, and I want to encourage you to stay focused. We're going to read chapter 3, but verses 7 on down, and I want you to stay with it. Let's read on verse 7. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed me earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. Well, let's walk through these verses. Boaz was in good spirit. It literally says he became happy. And it's a Hebrew idiom. Just like we have idioms in our language, we will say it's raining cats and dogs. Well, we don't mean literally animals are falling out of the sky. We know what we mean by that. We say where the rubber meets the road. Well, there may not be a tire involved at all, but we know what we mean by those things. And this is a Hebrew idiom. Let your heart be happy. It's the same exact phrase that was used in Judges chapter 9. Remember that? Story number 2. Judges number 9, chapter 19, verse number 9. The Levite's father-in-law, he's trying to get his son-in-law and his daughter to stay in the house. He wants to keep her safe. He failed. Remember that? The story of the father who he had an impression that something was bad, wrong, and he just wanted them to stay. But the son-in-law wouldn't have it, and off they went, and it led to disaster, her death. Now, catch the irony. Boaz is celebrating the end of a famine. He is celebrating the end of all this tragedy and misery. But the Levite's father-in-law is having a hollow, empty celebration that is meaningless. His daughter is leaving. He's full of anxiety and worry, and he just knows something horrible is going to happen, and it turns out he was right. In verse number 9, there's something too. Notice that it's Ruth who initiates the nighttime visit. I mean, that's a very risky move for a lady to go to the threshing floor. This is a well-respected community leader, Boaz. But she was so confident that she goes to the threshing floor and pulls back the cover of his feet and lays down at his feet. The threshing floor was the hub of activity. There are lots of other men there. and she was not supposed to be there, but she's so confident in what her mother-in-law told her to do. Confidence is huge. I was listening to Patrick McEnroe announce a tennis match at the US Open this last week. Listen to what Patrick McEnroe said about the importance of confidence, because I think there's some parallels. So he says, and hey, too, what I know about confidence. Confidence allows a player to perceive what's happening in a different way than they normally would. When you miss a shot, when you're low on confidence by an inch, you'll think, I'll never make that shot. I've missed it so many times. But when you miss it, when you're on a run, no worries, I'm going to make that next time. So the perception of reality is very different from a confident player. There's more forgiveness for a confident player to himself, to herself. And I think there's some application to us. We're talking about something far more valuable than a US Open championship in tennis. We're talking about the championship of your soul, your eternity. Confidence is so very important. And Ruth was very confident, so that she goes down to the threshing floor, raises the cover off his feet, and lays down. So we finish the story. Verse number 11. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I'm a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. And when she did it, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. And then he went back home. There's some key words in this text too. Verse number 14. No one must know. It is quiet and respectful and honorable. Boaz tries to protect the integrity and the reputation of a respectful woman. Boaz stands out. It's so very different from the others. In Judges chapter 17, all the way from Judges chapter 17 to Ruth chapter 4, those 9 chapters, Boaz is the only male character who consistently demonstrates compassion, integrity, moral courage in the face of challenge. Boaz stands head and shoulders above the rest. This is a man of God. I mean, now just think about it. You've got the Levite from Ephraim who is a male chauvinist, right? You remember that story? Macho machismo. He's a young man who's crude and he wants to be in charge. And so his concubine is in danger because men are pounding on the door wanting men to come out. He takes his concubine, throws her out. And then in the morning comes out and kicks her dead body and says, come on, let's go. So she doesn't get up. And Mr. Tough Guy, what does he do? Cuts her body in 12 pieces and sends it to all of Israel, and it leads to civil war. Or Boaz is so different from these other thuggish men who surrounded a man's house pounding on the door. They're loud and ruckus. They don't respect the woman's reputation. They toy with her. They abuse her. Boaz is a man of integrity and purity, and he stands head and shoulders above the rest. Verse number 13 says, stay here for the night. It's a sharp contrast to the father-in-law in Judges who wants his daughter to stay the night and for her son-in-law to stay the night, for his son-in-law. But she leaves with the son-in-law and when he commands. Boaz calls her, look, verse number 11, he calls her a noble woman. Boaz takes this masculine word, chayil, and makes it into a feminine word and applies it to Ruth. He says, you are a noble woman. It's the same word, by the way, that was used for the men from Dan. Remember the story of the tribe of the Danites? And they were the noble men of the city, and they went and conducted a massacre, a bloodbath. The little city of Laish just wiped it off the map. They weren't noble. But Boaz says, you are a noble woman. Now get this. Ruth is the only female in Judges 17 through Ruth 4 who is named noble. Boaz is the only man in Judges 17 through Ruth 4 who is noble. The concubine's father and the Gibeonite, remember those stories? You have to have a little background to follow this line of thought, but the concubine's father, he was a father figure. He wanted to do something good and rescue his daughter, but he failed miserably. The old Gibeonite, there's an example. He's a fatherly figure. He says, don't harm my daughter, don't harm my guests. And they keep pounding on the door, and he says, well, fine, just take my daughter. She's a virgin. She's never been with anyone. Just take her. Don't want her? Okay, just take this concubine. So they're different situations in one sense. I mean, the old Gibeonite, he's dealing with a raging mob, whereas Boaz is dealing with a perfumed young woman. So they're different in that respect. But I'm going to tell you something. The old Gibeonite in that story is a phony. You can tell a phony a mile away. We know who phonies are, right? I got an email this last week that the moment I opened it up, I knew this is a phony. It said, you have won $500,000 and an Apple laptop.
All right.
$500,000 and a laptop. I mean, that just sounds weird. It's like $500,000. Oh, and a laptop. And what let me know immediately is a phony, the very next words in the sentence following that, it started off this way: we are congratulating you. We don't talk that way. Not in English. Maybe if you're trying to transcribe it from some other language into English, I pictured some guy typing it out. We are congratulating you. We don't talk like that. And I got that email, I'm like, oh, that's a phony. They're wanting something, they're trying to hack my computer, who knows what. You see, the Gibeonite, he's a phony. He substitutes good intentions for the right thing to do. He intended to do well, but he didn't do it. He tries to reason with these lust-driven men who are pounding on the door. He tries to convince them to not do something vile and disgraceful. And then he turns around and does something vile and disgraceful. Here, take my daughter. Take his concubine. But contrast that against Boaz. We'll read later about how Boaz takes a stand in the midst of another group. He stands before the town council and pleads for the rights of this defenseless foreign woman. The father in Judges is an example of a failure, but Boaz is a model for future generations. The word kinsman redeemer is used 21 times in the book of Ruth. And that's really what I want to talk to you about next week when we wrap up this series. Kinsman redeemer is a picture of who Jesus is to us. He redeems us. He rescues us. The basic idea is that the kinsman redeemer can turn any wrong into something right. If you've got financial difficulty, the kinsman redeemer can turn it around. If you've got damages on your property, the kinsman redeemer can redeem that for you. The Redeemer is everything. And 21 times in the book of Ruth it talks about it. And like I said, that's really going to be the message next Sunday. But can you imagine how happy Ruth and Naomi were?
Yeah.
I mean, after everything that they've been through, now all of a sudden Boaz says, there's another guy in line ahead of me, and if he wants you, if he wants to be your Redeemer, then let him, he'll do it. But if he does not do it, I myself will redeem you. Can you imagine how in that moment all of the anxiety, all the stress, all the worry just melts away? Because my Redeemer is going to make it okay. These last verses of the chapter, and then we're done. Verse 16, when Ruth came to her father-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today."
Amen.
You know, sometimes you're going to face difficult situations in life. Sometimes you can relate to Ruth and Naomi and everything they have to go through, the battles that they face. The famine, death of their loved ones, the difficult journey, being destitute and poor and becoming pretty much like people on welfare by going to grab the crops out of the field. They had such a horrible time. But God was faithful to them, and God will be faithful to you and me. I read a story this last week in George Wood's book. George Wood is our national pastor. His title is the General Superintendent. He wrote a book called Road Trip, and it's like mileposts along the journey for a pastor. Tells a story in that book that is so powerful about somebody who went through a difficult time. It was a long time ago, and I didn't write this in my notes, but I believe, and I think I'm right on this, I think it was 1958. His parents, George Wood's parents, had been missionaries in northwest China with a native man there named Mr. Moon, and he became a pastor of a church. And George Wood's parents helped to establish the church, and it was growing and growing and doing well. And by 1958, and I think that's the year 1958, they had 500 believers. The church was just doing great. But then, things changed, and communism emerged, and China became what we call a closed country, and they kicked out missionaries, and the church had to go underground, and it was very, very different. So for 35 years, fast forward to 1983, George Wood gets the chance to travel back to China to meet Pastor Meng. And in the 35 years in between, Pastor Meng had been in and out of prison and been beaten so many times because of his faith in Christ Jesus. And so he was thrilled to get the chance to go and meet this hero of the faith. And he goes to meet with him and his wife. And as they sit in their little living room and they're talking, he says, "Pastor Meng, how many believers did you have when you reopened the church in 1983? He said, "George, we had 30. 35 years had passed. An enormous, strong church, 500, had dwindled down to 30 people. And Brother Wood said, "My heart sank. I just thought of all the work and how much effort had gone into establishing the church." But now it was 5 years later as they talked, and so in 1988 he said, "So you come back in 83 and you had 30 members to start all over with again. Pastor, how are you doing today? How many people do you have?" Pastor Meng said, would you like to see our baptism record? He said, I would love to see it. So he goes, has his wife go back in the back room. She brings out this very simple book. It had parchment paper on the inside, and the outside was cardboard slats, holes drilled through it, and yarn tying it together to make it into a book. And George Wood looked at the book and he thought, I wonder if they have anybody coming to the church at all. He placed it in his lap and said, here, just look. He opened it up, and the front page was filled with the name, the address, the phone number, and there must have been 15 people on the page. And he flipped it over, and here's another page with 16, 17, maybe 18 names written down. And as he's looking at the book, Pastor Mung says, before somebody can be baptized and get their name in this book, they must not only profess faith in Jesus Christ, but we require them to memorize certain scriptures. They must have attended church faithfully without missing for a certain number of weeks. They have to get tested out on their knowledge so that they are able to give their verbal testimony of how they got saved. And in addition to this, they may not be baptized unless they have led at least one person to Jesus. So Dr. Wood, every name in this book, these are people who have done all of those things. As he begins to flip through page after page, Pastor Mung, how many believers do you have now in 1988? He said, we have approximately 5,000 that have been baptized. And there are others in the process. When Pastor Mung died in the 90s, the church had grown to well over 15,000. Sometimes you're going to go through difficult times. There will be stretches in your life when you face battles that you did not ask for, you did not invite. But if you will stay faithful and trust your kinsman redeemer, knowing that he loves you and he cares for you, guess what? He is going to see you through faithfully to the other side. This morning we had the chance to receive communion. And so I'm thrilled and honored to be able to receive communion with my brothers and sisters. I just want to ask the musicians to come back, and we're going to receive communion. Our ushers are going to serve you this morning, and gentlemen, if you go ahead and get in place. While they're coming, let me just tell you, you don't have to be a member of this church to receive communion.